Andrew, welcome on the podcast.
Thanks, Jake. It's great to see you again. I think it's been maybe a year and a half since we
Great to
hung
see you
out
too,
in
Andrew.
Bali.
Thank you for joining. Yeah, Bali, the Indonesia Bitcoin Conference. So shout out to the guys that set that up. It was an awesome experience. I believe it's happening again this year, maybe? It was every 2 years, I think they were going to do it.
That sounds right, yes.
Yeah.
It was
Do my
wild.
best
That
to
was
get
my
back
first,
there.
in fact.
Was it? Yeah, cool.
And maybe you remember that. Well, of course you remember this. You were the MC. But it began with this ceremony with a giant cardboard dinosaur fighting. Was it a robot? What was
I wasn't quite sure what was going on.
The dinosaur represented fiat money, and then some other creature was fighting it that represented Bitcoin. And there were fake paper money notes flying everywhere with drums, very loud drums.
It was an awesome experience. My time getting into Bitcoin and becoming closer to it and learning more about it and investing in it more was always in Australia, and in particular that lockdown phase. And so suddenly to hop on a plane, head up to Bali, be the MC of an event there, having started a podcast, it was this awesome experience of meeting new people. And I think my takeaway feeling was like, to kill Bitcoin, you have to kill everyone. That's just like,
there are a bunch of dinosaur fighters out there.
Exactly. Like, how do you do that? Oh, yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and I recommend anyone go. So, Andrew, to start today, I'm going to be super direct. Why should I get interested in and research resistance money?
Resistance Money is the name of a book that I recently published with 2 other co-authors. We're academics, and in particular, we're academic philosophers. So it's a good question. Why should anyone pay attention to what philosophers, much less academic philosophers, have to say about Bitcoin? Here's a couple of things that set Resistance Money apart from many other Bitcoin books. First, because it's written by academics, it's very thoroughly researched with lots of resources, over 500 sources, footnotes, and entries in the bibliography. Second, it's comprehensive in its approach, where other Bitcoin books only look at, for example, monetary policy, or only look at financial inclusion, or only look at Bitcoin as investable asset. We actually provide an ethical framework to evaluate Bitcoin along many dimensions, and to evaluate not just its usefulness for one person, but rather to answer the question whether it's good for the world as a whole. So we look at Bitcoin from the perspective of monetary institutions, of privacy, of financial inclusion, of possible negative and positive externalities, its security model, and answer about 25 different objections to Bitcoin throughout the course of the book. So perhaps the third thing that sets it apart and that makes it interesting for readers, at least in our experience, is that we really try to take the critics seriously. This is not cheerleading for the choir. Rather, we try to state the objections so well that when the critics write to us, they say, yes, that's what I meant. That first paragraph where you set up the objection about Bitcoin being a Ponzi scheme, that is exactly my view. And you said it better than I could. When a critic tells us that, we know that we're doing our job well. And we try to do that throughout. There are literally 25 objections scattered throughout the book that we address. So this isn't cheerleading. It's an attempt to give an honest evaluation. And you can guess, without knowing anything more about me, if you know Jake's podcast, the evaluation is positive. But there are qualms and quirks and caveats along the way. So we really try to be intellectually honest about all of that and not just try to pump the corn or convince people to buy this thing without actually understanding it.
Awesome introduction, Andrew. Thank you. I confess, I haven't finished it. I was like, come on, Jake, finish the book before you get
Jake, there's about 8 billion people who are in that very situation. So you're in a good place.
I think I'm probably about 60 to 70% of the way through.
Oh, thank you.
And I would absolutely echo, I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's very thorough. And you haven't unturned any stone that's obvious. And I haven't even finished the book, right? But what I love is I'm an investor. I'm looking at like, what can I buy? How long should I hold it for? When should I sell? Why should I do this stuff? And Bitcoin's just this thing that's just come into my life and just taken more and more mind share. And because it just does an incredible job of store of value with good property rights and not being debased on the back end. It's just extraordinarily good at that one seemingly simple job. And so when I come across a book like this, I'm like, okay, who are the guys that wrote this? Why do they have expertise? And it comes through very clearly on the book alone. So from a first principles perspective, let me read it. Do I think this is true? Yes or no? and it's just yes every single time. But what's fun is, let's dig a little deeper into a bit about you guys, the team that created it. When you say you're an academic, what does that mean? And in particular, this idea of a philosopher as well.
Long ago, I learned this about myself. I loved to argue. And I was an annoying little kid who would just take any weird position and argue with adults around me. Anyone who would listen.
So annoying. I know exactly.
Incredibly annoying.
Yeah.
So I thought that the thing for me to do would be to be a lawyer. After all, you not only get to argue, but you get paid. So that seemed like the thing to do. And I planned to do that all the way up until my final year of university. But I missed the law school admissions exam that summer before my final year because I was up all night fighting with my girlfriend the night before.
Classic.
So like, okay, I cannot walk into the most important test of my life having pulled an all-nighter, the exam 3 hours later. So I kind of just put pause on that plan. And then I thought, well, I love philosophy. I was a philosophy major, and I thought that would prepare me to be a lawyer. Maybe I could just take the graduate school admissions exam instead and apply to PhD programs in philosophy. So I always knew that I liked philosophy. I liked to argue. I liked that part of philosophy. But the other part about it that attracted me was concerned with ideas and abstraction, trying to see beyond particulars of a case and something very concrete to see the principles behind the case, the more abstract forces at play, and see how they apply to other cases. So it's an attraction to abstraction, too, that led me to philosophy. And this is something that philosophers have in common with economists who look not just to the economy, but rather to the forces that drive it. That's what price theory is all about, for example. So it's those things in particular that led me to try to be an academic in philosophy. And I specialized, taught, and did research in a number of areas that had nothing to do with money or with Bitcoin. But along the way, Jake, my students dragged me into the real world. They had to go get jobs, and they wanted to talk at the dining hall all the time about money, about salary, about this pull that it had over their hearts, the worries they had about it at night. These are 22-year-old kids who are already thinking about retirement plans and their portfolio and negotiating salaries. So I started to teach a class on money that spoke to those concerns, an interdisciplinary class about the psychology, philosophy, politics, economics of money. And perhaps it will be of no surprise to you at all that they also wanted to talk about Bitcoin. So that's how the academic side of me got pulled into thinking about money and more concrete concerns once again. So I guess I come full circle from wanting to be a lawyer and make a bunch of money, arguing with people about ideas through philosophy, and back to arguing about ideas, including those that concern money. So here I am, man.
It's awesome. It's just so fascinating where inspiration comes from. In a sense, it can come from anywhere, but equally, there are there's probably a number of topics that your students would have asked you about over the years, and this is the one that drew you in, right?
And pornography and social media as well. These are the things that the potential idols that dominate their life. They love to talk about that too, and money.
Yeah, and that's what I find cool. It's okay, it sucks you in, and okay. What's cool as well is you talk about an ethical framework in the book, and you talk about standing behind the veil. So please just explain to those out there that haven't read the book yet what that means as a stance for analyzing ideas.
In addition to knowing whether Bitcoin is worth buying and holding, the kinds of questions that brought you to it, Jake, here's a big ethical question we might want to know, which is whether Bitcoin's actually good for the world. And an ethical investor will want to know this. Just as an ethical investor will want to know, is investing in a tobacco company going to make my world worse or not? You might want to know something about the product and its effects on people when making that decision. And that's not ethics divorced from investment there, because if it's bad for the world and bad for people, that might inform your investment thesis. For example, that people will wean their reliance on cigarettes and move to something else instead. So one thing we wanted to do was help people think about that. Is Bitcoin actually good for the world? And that's a different question than, is Bitcoin good for me? So what we wanted is to find a thought experiment or some sort of principle that would help us separate our own goods, our own concerns, from those that are relevant to assessing Bitcoin for the world. What we came up with is this. It's a thought experiment. Imagine that you fall asleep and that when you wake up, you will be someone, but you don't know who that person will be. Could be Michael Saylor, CEO of Strategy. Could be Jake Woodhouse, an Englishman who lives in Melbourne, is it? Could be a philosophy
Now
professor
Byron,
in
but yes,
Singapore.
in Australia, yeah.
It could be a Venezuelan farmer. It could be a dissident journalist in Russia. You don't know. Now imagine that you could choose whether Bitcoin will exist in the world or not after you wake up, and you again don't know who you'd be. What this helps us do is think about the people for whom Bitcoin is good and think about it in this abstracted, worldly sense rather than only from our own perspectives. And one striking feature about Bitcoin is that it helps people on certain margins, people like dissident journalists or criminals of certain kinds, or people interested in funding terrorism, or people who are resisting authoritarian regimes, margins of many kinds, good and bad. Bitcoin is a useful tool for them. And if you have a chance of being one of those people, we argue that you would want there to be Bitcoin in the world, to be there for you as a useful tool, as an option, and as a means of resistance for the authorities that would try to get between you and your money, the authorities that would try to block transactions, to surveil or control on the basis of political ideology, or to debase the only currency available to you, as happens to something like 2 billion people alive today, suffering under double-digit inflation every year. So for those people, even if you aren't in fact one of those people, you could have been, or you have a 1 in 4 chance of being such a person. And once you see that, then we think that you can see that, yes, Bitcoin is good for the world. Even if you're one of these people who says, I don't know, I have access to the Aussie dollar, I have access to the Singapore dollar, I don't need Bitcoin. That's not the question. The question isn't whether you need Bitcoin or whether it's good for you. It's whether it's good for the world. We found it helpful to see that extra good that Bitcoin does for the world beyond just what it does for me, some normie academic in Singapore who has access to a pretty good fiat money system as far as those things go.
Bitcoin with Jake was a podcast I created from 2022 to 2023, and I interviewed about 80 people all across the world. And the countries in which people sat where financial services were poorest had the most compelling buy Bitcoin stories. And so it was clear to me that, to take a kind of startup analogy, product market fit was on the financial fringes. And that remains true from an individual perspective, from a nation state perspective, and from basically any organization. The case for Bitcoin to receive value, to send value, to store value with no ID requirements, just an internet connection, it's an absolute game changer. And that was something that I found very interesting, because it hammered home that this wasn't just like some speculative thing. It was like, no, it's actually providing value for people today in massive quantities. And you can have someone say, oh, it's just a Ponzi. But once you start digging underneath and looking at the finer details, it's just so clearly not the case. And I like that word abstract, because I think a lot of us haven't slowed down and asked what is a philosophical question. What is money? And perhaps you could argue that money is an abstraction of our time and energy. And I've seen people talk about this a lot, but your students come to you, they've got all these different questions. And I assume when you're sitting in a position like that, the instinct to teach is very, very strong. And it's like, okay, how can I teach these kids to live a healthier and happier life? But like, how do you know that you're teaching them the right thing? And just reflect on, if you may, the process of learning about Bitcoin when you're in that position. How did you first start looking into it? And why was it clear that needed to be included in your class about money?
Your first question is a deep and important one for any teacher to grapple with, because teaching is an important responsibility, especially if you conceive of teaching as imparting something to someone else, because then you need to be damn well sure that what you're imparting is correct and good and true and beautiful. And if it isn't, you're leading young people astray. Actually think of teaching as slightly different than imparting. And one of the main tools I use as a teacher is not telling somebody something, it's asking them something. And this is going to sound corny. It goes all the way back to Socrates. What did he do on the streets of Athens? He asked questions. And of course, his questions were annoying ones that drove people batty, and they killed him for it. But
Wow.
philosophers tend to take him as a kind of patron saint for a good reason. A question is a powerful tool. You alluded to one question: what is money? Of course, there are many good questions. So I see one of my jobs as a teacher is just to find the question that a student needs in her place, in his time, given their own concerns in life, and ask them in a way that gets them to see its importance and the difficulty in actually answering it. And once you see those two things, that a question's important and that it's hard to answer, it'll drive you mad. It'll drive you to learn, that is. It'll drive you to be curious,
Yeah,
to
I've got to
investigate.
figure this out. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I see as my job in the classroom, is often not to say things, it's to ask them and make students say things and grow themselves the capacities to find the answers they need.
Cool. I love that. And I would have, had times been different, I would have enjoyed being taught by you, because that's so much more compelling than having someone at the front of a classroom just regurgitate what's in the textbook. And I could list off, 5 or 10 names from my, now quite a long time since I left school, but I remember that so well. It's like, oh, this person's so boring. You know what I mean? I literally just could read the book if I was going to go to this class.
You should just read the book in those cases. If a professor doesn't have anything to add to the book, they should reconsider their life choices, in my opinion.
And so, Andrew, I'd love to spend some more time just thinking around like the word philosophy. What's the history of philosophy? And if you were to describe yourself as a philosopher, what does that really mean?
There's a fancy answer to that question and a less fancy one.
Let's
The
go less
fancy
fancy.
answer is that we'll start with that, then move on quickly. I'm not a very fancy person. The fancy version is that philosophy, philosophia, is love of wisdom. And the word for love is not love like erotic love. That would be eros, Sophia. It's not. It's philo, which is friend love, the love of a friend with a friend. So literally, philosophy is being friendly with wisdom, making friends with wisdom.
Wow, I love
And that's what the Greek philosophers were trying to do. It's a kind of familiarity with wisdom, not desiring it as erotic love does, desiring unity with it. That's erotic love, but rather desiring friendship with it and seeking to be familiar and affectionate with wisdom itself. Okay, that's the fancy thing. That's what people like Plato and Aristotle thought they were pursuing. Philosophy is something in academia now that's a little bit different. It's an academic discipline. And that means that it's a set of cultural rules, of books that we've all read, of questions that we take seriously together. And it's much more technical, especially in the English-speaking world, the so-called Anglophone world, which is largely dominated by what's called analytic philosophy. The tools of analytic philosophy are all aimed at clarity, concision, and precision. Instead of thinking these big, dreamy thoughts and trying to be wise in some kind of fancy way that looks smart, analytic philosophers tend to be much more anal, and they're focused on something sharp that I actually understand and that's not so vague. It has to be precise and clean. And that has both good and bad effects. The good effects is that it forces us into rigor and clarity of thought and speech. The bad effect is that it's kind of exsanguinating. It takes the blood out of the concerns that drove us to seek wisdom in the first place. What we wanted when we come to philosophy, and what students often want when they come to a philosophy class, is wisdom or clarity when it comes to big life questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What can I hope for? What must I do? What does it all mean? Those are the big questions. And then we replace them with questions like, what is Plato's argument for the immortality of the soul in Phaedo 136b? I'm like, okay, well, you've just put your students to sleep. And give a premise, conclusion, formulation of the argument. Now, what's good there is that it is clear, concise, and precise. What's bad is that it's taken the life out of things. So I often live in my career somewhere between those two ends, between trying to look towards those big questions that drove my students to me and that drove me to philosophy in the first place, really caring about what matters and what it all means. And on the other hand, to actually make progress in an intellectual endeavor, you have to get technical and careful and slow. That's how science works. So it shouldn't surprise us that would work something like that in philosophy too. But you can't lose your soul along the way. So as I guess I said, I move back and forth between those poles.
I also, at one point, was like, do I want to be a lawyer? And I came down hard on I just don't want to spend my life looking at textbooks and just telling people the rules. But the older I've got, the more I've understood that actually, depending on what kind of law you've got into, of course, but it's the interesting part of the job is the gray area. It's like, well, actually, was that right or wrong? And yes, there's precedent, but this new example that's a real case is different to the precedent in these ways. So what is the right way to look at it? And it strikes me what you're just describing.
That's the philosopher's favorite tool.
Yes.
Let's draw a distinction.
That's kind of really the same thing that you're talking about here. I get so much value from listening to you explain that, because if you've got that background and you come to Bitcoin and you start analyzing it with that pre-existing skill set, and out of the back end of that, you have a positive review for it, you start going to conferences, you spend a ton of time writing a book. But that's a question I'd love to ask, actually. How long did it take to write the book?
I want to ask you about your book, actually. I know you've been working on one for perhaps a year now. What's the latest on that?
It hasn't gone anywhere. So I did something called a 30-day writing challenge. I've got a manuscript with 15,000 to 18,000 words, and it got stuck. I had a third baby, and we were moving house, and just before you know it, I haven't looked at it for months now. But it's certainly something that I guess I haven't really hammered home why. Why is it I want to write a book? Well, actually, that's unfair. I know why I want to write a book. What I realized when I went through that experience is I wanted to write a really good one. And just churning out a book in 30 days was kind of defeated the object. And in some ways, that's procrastination coming in and going, actually don't let good get in the way of great type thinking. It's very unhelpful. But let's just say I've lost momentum, but I would love inspiration to get back into it. And I, having now been the father of 3 kids, can say we won't be having any more, and things will start to mellow out a bit like that. So I'll have more time. But yeah, I love the concept of people's personal journeys to Bitcoin all being completely unique. And I believe that the journey I've been on is very, very helpful for people to think about what you might do if you're in a position where you got given some money. Because I was an inheritance
I remember
in my
mid-20s.
Yeah, from my father dying young. So I was thrust into this position of financial authority much earlier in my life than most people. And I've had more time to therefore figure it out. And the answer is basically buy as much Bitcoin as you can and enjoy your life, rather than have a stressful portfolio of things that you don't really know what they are and take up all your time to manage. But I think it could be told very well as a story.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember part of your story was also dealing with siblings and other family members and learning how to think together with them about Bitcoin. And let's not say stuffing orange pills into your brother's mouth or something like that. But I seem to remember that this was part of the challenge you faced, and maybe something unique you have to offer is
I was
reflections
part
on
of
that.
and thank you for turning the tables on the questions, Andrew. I like that sometimes. It's always good to have a two-way discussion rather than just ask the questions the whole time. So actually, yeah, shout out to my brother and sister. They're both here with me at the moment on holiday, so they're downstairs somewhere. I was toying with the idea of getting them on a podcast and talking about this, which I think is a good idea, but I haven't planned this trip.
I'll tune in for that one.
Yeah, it's what we ended up doing as a family investment trust is we took a 10% Bitcoin position in very, very early 2023. So fantastic timing from a price action perspective, but very long-term play. And ultimately what we did was I was basically heckling my siblings all the time about how important Bitcoin was. And they weren't very interested and remained
so the 10%
still
was a compromise between a higher allocation you would have liked?
Yes, I would absolutely prefer a higher allocation than that. Even now that it's worth, let's say, almost 20% of the total portfolio.
I was going to say, you automatically got what you wanted, didn't you, over time?
In a sense,
you didn't reallocate.
But the other 90%, when we first made that decision, has basically gone backwards. And actually been really interesting because you touched on this before about the idea of ethics when it comes to investing. And so the portfolio is essentially split between a Bitcoin position, and currently the rest of it is managed by someone who is what's called an impact investor. And so they have a system called positive screening, where they basically go out in the world and they look for particular investment opportunities that fit a bunch of predetermined requirements. And they actually get a investor to sit down with them, or customer of theirs, and they pull out all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they're like, which ones of these are your favorite? And then they try and map a portfolio allocation to those SDGs. And so it can be like gender equality, or it can be like clean water, or whatever the different goals are.
Bringing humanity to the stars.
Yeah. Back in 2018, I was very interested in impact investing. And I personally did a reallocation into it from a more kind of traditional wealth management portfolio. And that then has ultimately evolved into basically selling everything that I personally had in those areas into Bitcoin, because I saw it as a better investment opportunity from a pure capital growth perspective. But actually, Bitcoin does all the things that the Sustainable Development Goals claims to want to do. That's what's interesting about this. So when, like, we could have this discussion now, which I could basically take to my siblings and be like, guys, the current investment manager that's allocating capital for us with the SDGs in mind has a high ethical sense or thought process that we're wanting to ride on the coattails of and invest alongside. And their promise is you can invest with us and you can still get financial returns as if it was a traditionally managed portfolio, and you can have a high impact on the world. And they're looking at, long-term technology plays like renewable energy, and they're looking at a number of different things. But I think Bitcoin does it far better. And you can probably tell me why. What is the ethical case for Bitcoin? And I believe that Bitcoin is the best impact investment you can possibly make. But these money managers, they don't look at it, right? They'll actually propose to you things like a long-term bond from the World Bank doing some kind of project in the Amazon. You're like, having read Alex Gladstein's work and this idea of like,
I'm going to start hyperventilating if you talk about that too much.
Right?
just the sheer goofiness of that idea.
You're like, I don't want World Bank bonds.
No.
Fuck off. Like this is the money printer. This is the problem. And
it might be worse. It might be the money printer in service of colonialism, or neo-monetary colonialism, whatever Alex calls it.
Yes.
It might be quite a bit worse, in fact.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to remember the word he used, because he also was at the Indonesia Bitcoin conference and did a fantastic talk, and he just strode on the stage, no notes, he just knew his shit. And you're like,
yes,
awesome. I absolutely love that. He calls it like de-development or something. I can't remember what the phrase is exactly. I'll have to look it up. But yes, so Andrew, the concept of Bitcoin as an ethical investment with your philosophical lens, what are the highest takeaways when you approach Bitcoin from that perspective?
If I may, I'd like to plug an article that I wrote with Troy Cross, published a couple of years ago. It's called Mine Your Values, and we published it in CoinDesk. The idea there, it's kind of a pun. The idea is we have values. We have things that we care about that we wish to promote in the world. Step one, mine them in this sense. That is, find out what they are. Dig a little bit, do a little introspection, a little thinking, a little philosophy to find out what your values are. And then second, enact them in the world through your investments. And the hypothesis we had in that article is that Bitcoin mining was, in fact, one important way for Bitcoiners to enact their values in the world, especially Bitcoiners who cared about a sustainable future, carbon neutrality, or at any rate, reducing carbon emissions, and so on. And what we proposed is that Bitcoin is a way to promote a couple of different values, including those environmental ones, but also cypherpunk values. If you care about a future where there is available to all a money that enables us to escape surveillance and control from both private and public authorities, you will want to promote that value somehow and concretely, and not just in the ballot box, but with your investments as well. Bitcoin is the answer there. So we developed that case in a couple thousand words. It's not too long, but with some detail there. But
awesome. We'll get it in the show notes. I'll dig it up.
I like your framing, Jake, which is, and actually, though I probably disagree with some of the investment advisors you're talking to, I like the idea of conceiving of your portfolio as a way to move the world in the direction that you want it. and not just a way to grow itself. In fact, these often go hand in hand when pursued thoughtfully. So how does that work for Bitcoin? Well, here's maybe a question that's worth thinking about is, when I buy Bitcoin, who am I benefiting? And the answer is holders of Bitcoin. Well, who holds Bitcoin? Large corporate treasuries? Yes. Some nation states? Yes. But overwhelmingly, Bitcoin is held by we don't know who. Over half that pie, if you look at the total distribution, even the most generous assessment of the best evidence we have about who owns what pie of existing coins, it's small holders who are pseudonymous or anonymous. And these are people who actually use Bitcoin, not merely speculating on it, not merely holding it, but using it as money. So there's a very real sense in which when I buy and use Bitcoin, i.e., raise its price on the margin by not selling, by taking that liquidity off the order book, and when I raise its utility by accepting it for payments or offering it as payment, I'm benefiting that army of anons who hold Bitcoin. Who is that? Well, some of them are criminals. Some of them are good criminals. Notice not all criminals are bad. Some of them are people like Alexei Navalny, dissident journalist and opposition leader in Russia, recently deceased. Some of them are people like Roya Maboob, a software developer in Afghanistan who was not allowed to own a bank account because she was a woman and used Bitcoin instead. Some of them were software developers who worked for Roya, some of whom were able to leave Afghanistan and take their value with them across borders, bad husbands, abusive uncles notwithstanding, because it wasn't in a bank account, it was in Bitcoin. So I think a sober look at who actually uses Bitcoin gives this answer to the question, who do I benefit? Well, a big cross-section of humanity, but a significant chunk of that cross-section includes the least well-off among us, those people who have fled to Bitcoin as a refuge from monetary debasement and local authoritarian rule. So if you want to build an ethical case for buying Bitcoin, I actually think it's pretty empirically solid. And if you have values that include things like helping women in Afghanistan or dissident journalists under authoritarian rule, you got a pretty good case.
Absolutely agree. The funny part, and maybe I'll get them to listen to this, is sometimes you don't really want to listen to your sibling. And that's
Of course
okay.
not. You've been listening to them for 30 years, dude.
Yeah.
Why would you want?
Oh, fuck off, Jake. Seriously. And that's fair enough. And that's why it's quite helpful to be able to send other people saying the same thing. I believe in business as a economic force to improve things, let's just say. And to highlight some of the areas I think that this existing impact investor that we're using is confused, it's very clear to me. It's like exactly what you've highlighted, which is like, one, why don't you look at Bitcoin? And it's just a straight blanket, can't, corrupt, uses too much energy, inefficient, criminals. There's all the usual FUD. And regulation will play into that to some degree. But it's like, well, who uses the World Bank? Who does that actually
Who
benefit?
banked Jeffrey Epstein?
Hopefully we'll
Jeffrey
find out
Epstein
soon.
didn't bank himself.
Yeah, I mean, who's on his list? Let's find out. But like every time you use a pound, you use a dollar, you use a euro. Like, who are you benefiting there? And no one stops to think that, right? That's the default position of like, well, this is what I use, and what you're suggesting is wrong or whatever. So that's actually a really nice framing, isn't it? To think about, okay, well, look at who actually uses this thing. And I think that's what was cool about, because I did flick to the very conclusion of Resistance Money. And that came up there. You mentioned some of those characters. You're like, yeah, well, even if I was not me, I'd want those people to be able to, send, receive, and store value in a way that wasn't hugely influenced. Andrew, I'd love to talk through a section of the book I've recently been through, which is around privacy. You mentioned the words pseudonymous and anonymous. Please help us understand the difference between those two things. And equally, there was a section where you were describing the benefits of physical cash and backward tracking transactions and forward tracking transactions. And that was laid out brilliantly, and in a way that, I mean, I don't know, 50 Bitcoin books in by this stage. No one else had done as well as you did. in my research so far.
Thank you for reading, Jake. You've honored us with your careful
No,
attention.
it's a pleasure. It's a brilliant book.
Bitcoiners are often embarrassed to talk about privacy, and one overwhelming feeling is that Bitcoin is just so bad on privacy that to even discuss it is slightly uncomfortable. It's thought to be bad on privacy for this reason. It's an open ledger that anyone can read, and anyone can trace any given transaction all the way back to the coin's initial minting in a block. So that would appear on its face to be a great threat to financial privacy. One of the things we do in that chapter is to develop that threat, to explain why, yes, indeed, Bitcoin is a threat to financial privacy for those who use it, for roughly the reasons just given. It is a public ledger where coins can be tracked. And they can be tracked both forwards and backwards, as you allude to. So when I send you some Bitcoin, Jake, you can look back and see which address sent me Bitcoin and which address sent it Bitcoin, all the way back to some Coinbase transaction, which is just the transaction in a block that minted those Satoshis initially, or the origin, the ancestor of those Satoshis. And it can be traced forward as well. So I spend some Bitcoin to you, and then you spend it to somebody else. I can tell. I just look on a block explorer and I can see how it was spent and where it went to. Now, there are importantly things that I can't tell. If all I have is a block explorer, I can't tell the real world identity of where you spent that money to, and you can't tell where I got it from. It's just this gobbledygook. It's an address, BC1 ... It's a public key little bit of cryptography, and that's it. Unfortunately, there are real world entities who can associate public Bitcoin addresses with real world identities. Every exchange with which you've ever interacted can do this with the addresses that you've used to send or receive Bitcoin and your own account. Presumably you gave them a passport or a photo of it. So they know that BC1 ... that's Jake's address or one of Jake's thousands of addresses. And these entities collude and discuss with each other. So there are global databases available to all, not all literally, but to all of them, to collate and correlate real-world identities with Bitcoin addresses. Now, from the perspective of financial privacy, that's very distressing. So that is the negative picture that is often all that one sees when thinking about Bitcoin and privacy. That's the bad news. There is some good news, though. The good news is that despite being an open ledger, Bitcoin has two important properties. The first one is that it is still pseudonymous in this sense. There isn't a real world name built into each transaction. Unlike a PayPal transaction, every transaction built into the TX data is some real world names. With Bitcoin, it's just cryptography. It's signatures and public addresses. So that's one thing to observe here. Second, Bitcoin is also permissionless, which allows us to do a bunch of different things that you could never do with a PayPal transaction. So let's say I wanted to generate 1,000 PayPal accounts with 1,000 fake names, and then I send my money. So I have a PayPal account attached to my name. I split it across those fake names, and then I send it to 1,000 more, and then slowly start to put it back into the economy, to spend it on things, or even to send it to myself under a different identity. Could I do that with PayPal? Well, you're welcome to try, and here's what would happen. You get shut down immediately. This is a violation of every regulation that they're required to follow. It's a permissioned system. You can't do anything without their permission and the permission of their regulators, and those include banks they interact with and deputized partners and other financial institutions, all under the thumb of the state and under the commercial and central bank apparatus. Now, Bitcoin, by contrast, is permissionless. I can split my Bitcoin into 1,000 tiny pieces and join it with others who've done the same. It's called coin joining, in a word. I can also send it over Lightning, which removes it from its on-chain footprint and allows the Bitcoin to transfer without leaving any trace at all on a blockchain. Thus, there's nothing for someone to see on a block explorer. So the cool thing and the promising thing about Bitcoin is that its permissionless architecture allows us to regain some of the privacy that we've lost due to its public ledger. So in the end, the chapter leaves us with an uneasy tension because there are very real and disturbing facts about Bitcoin's privacy features, namely that it doesn't natively have any. It's far worse than cash in that respect. But we can make it more cash-like when we use these tools. So it's like digital cash in that respect. And just as cash is good for the world because it allows us to take possession of our own funds, to spend it without permission of third parties, and to do it somewhat privately, so also Bitcoin does the same, and thus also makes the world better in that respect. That's the basic argument of the chapter in about 2.5 minutes.
No,
Thank you for reading.
It's very compelling. And I particularly like to highlight this idea of like how cash currently functions. So example being my coffee shop down the road. I walk in there with a $50 note and I buy a couple coffees and a smoothie and stuff with my daughters, and I hand over a $50 note. The shop has no idea where the $50 has come from, hasn't had any way of recording my personal data with that transaction. The note itself, although it might have some unique identifier on it, the infrastructure doesn't exist for every single till that's accepting cash in an economy to record that and then, basically track all of this. And then the cafe goes and does whatever they want to do with it. Before you know it, it's like coin join gazillion, right? You just never be able to track.
And forward privacy.
Yeah.
You can't tell where the note came from. They can't tell where the note came from, and you can't tell where it's going after you spend it to the coffee shop.
But it's been debased. So like everything in life, it's really just all about trade-offs. And so when you're using Bitcoin, because of the nature of the on-ramp to Bitcoin being so heavily policed, like getting hold of virgin Bitcoin straight from a miner is possible. And I know people that do it. And having a non-KYC stack is absolutely possible. But it's a small fraction of the total Bitcoin transaction volume. I wouldn't have a stat to mind. I don't know if you've ever.
I bought some non-KYC Bitcoin today, literally less than 3 hours ago.
Awesome.
When I woke up, I got some non-KYC.
There you go. So it's absolutely possible, and I always encourage people to look into what that means and why they should do it. Would you prefer, and this is the idea, isn't it, behind the veil, very philosophical question, do you prefer a world in which you have a cash that has better privacy but is not a very good store of value, i.e. doesn't fulfill one of the three core functions of money, unit of accounts, store of value, medium of exchange, or do you drop some of your privacy preferences in exchange for having a better sound money? It's a trade-off. And I love that because Bitcoin's open source, you're right, like it's a permissionless architecture. The Lightning Network is very, very successful at what it's doing, even though people seem to write it off for some reason. And I would imagine that on a long enough time horizon and with a significant enough problem, something else will be created to solve that.
One thing we didn't discuss in the book, it was too nascent at the time that we were doing the writing and original research, roughly 2021 and 2022, was the rise of eCash on Bitcoin. What this does is offer a different kind of trade-off. You give up full self-custody of Bitcoin and instead trust a mint. So you give a mint your Bitcoin, and in return, they give you eCash tokens, which are little IOUs that represent the Bitcoin held by the mint. And what you get, so what you've given up is custody, but what you get is the full privacy assurances of the eCash system. This was a very early cryptographic system developed by the computer scientist David Chaum in 1981, 1982, that has, to this day, extremely robust privacy guarantees. So there are other kinds of trade-offs or margins where we can find them for those who need privacy the most. Now, the thing that I'm most excited about with eCash is not that really basic kind of trade-off, giving up custody to get privacy, but rather enhancements to eCash that interact, and the basic protocol here, it's called Cashew. Really cool for those who don't know it. Look it up. It's run by not run by, but one of the lead developers is a lovely Bitcoiner named Callie, or not named, but pseudonymously named Callie. One of the cool things that Callie is working on with Cashew is developing auditing systems and ways to reduce the risk of custody. So, for example, an automated bank run where everybody drains the mint of the Bitcoin and then refresh and start a new mint, and do this periodically, basically forces the mint to not rehypothecate the Bitcoin that you've given them. and then using Lightning to connect mints to each other so that they're interoperable and interoperable via Lightning and the nodes they're each running with the chain itself. So you can have your eCash tokens, which are extremely private, just as good as cash in that respect in terms of privacy, but then also get them immediately exchanged for eCash tokens associated with a different mint, or even get them sent via Lightning to your own Lightning node, or even to an on-chain address. So it reduces the risks of custody, but gives its users extremely robust privacy guarantees. Very cool, and all made possible, again, by Bitcoin's permissionless architecture. Nobody told Callie that he could or couldn't do this. He just did. He just thought it'd be a cool idea. And now he's got a bunch of his friends working on it. They're very busy in their Telegram channel, fussing with new ideas and new ways to make it more private, more robust, and less risky for users. Super cool and fun.
And I love that kind of story because, well, first of all, I'm going to start doing some early stage equity investing, and there'll be a business model somewhere that someone wants to create a product in and around that. I just think it'd be so interesting to start placing some bets on some early stage entrepreneurs that can go and build these things. And that's a discussion for another time, to be honest. But what I love about that is actually the core proposition of buying and holding Bitcoin is there's a great diagram somewhere, and it shows how the internet in its current form enabled, the Fantastic Seven or whatever they're called, right? These breakout internet businesses that are digital monopolies and walled gardens that, misbehave, get kicked out, but they've been able to monetize people's attention with advertising. And it's been extremely successful. Or, Amazon, the online retailer, when you look at those, they're all internet enabled companies, but you had to own stock in all 7 of them to get the upside. Whereas Bitcoin is a base layer protocol that you can buy a portion of the network. No, you won't be debased, i.e. they're not going to sell more shares. Like if you bought early stage equity in any one of the Magnificent Seven, you would have been diluted a lot on the way to IPO and today. Bitcoin, that can't happen as long as you hold on to your position. And you get to benefit from the value that is created in its entirety on top of it, which is a whole different ballgame when it comes to how to look at it. And I loved that when I first understood it.
Buying Bitcoin is the only way to invest in Nostr, and it is the only way to invest in Cashew. If you think Nostr is going to be cool and widely used, the way to profit off that is actually to buy the native money that's used in Nostr, the Nostr native money, which is Bitcoin. So also for Cashew and for other things as of yet undiscovered that plug into Bitcoin via Cashew or via Nostr and so on.
Exactly. It's building blocks that come in that only amplify the base layer value. Nostr, I'm glad that's come up actually. So I'm aware of time. I normally shoot for about an hour, Andrew, so we'll wrap up fairly soon. But you're the first guest on the podcast that I contacted via Nostr DM. And the process is a bit sketchy. I'm never quite sure who I've got an inbox message from. And
I think I didn't get it for a week or two because it was in my spam folder.
Maybe. And I'm like, is this real or not real? That experience can only get better, right? But what draws you to Nostr and what do you like about it?
There are things that I don't wish to see on the internet. And for that reason, I'm sometimes grateful for moderated walled gardens. There are kinds of gore or pornography that I simply won't be exposed to on Twitter by virtue of the fact that there are moderators hard at work to moderate, which is another word for censor. There are also some things on the internet that other people don't want me to see that I would like to see. You can guess what some of those might be, and some of those I won't ever tell you. Perhaps it's lawful, perhaps it's not, but sometimes people have weird or extremist or downright dangerous opinions or ideas. I'd like to know about them. I'd like to read what they're saying, and on many of these walled gardens, I simply can't. Nostr, by contrast, is not a walled garden. Anybody can contribute, and if I want to see what somebody says, all I need to know is their npub and have a few good guesses about which relay they're using, and then I have access to their content. And it would be very difficult or expensive for someone to stop me from doing so. So that's my perspective as a consumer or a reader or viewer of content is that Nostr is my pathway to seeing what certain weirdos are up to on the internet that I wouldn't have visibility into otherwise if I just stuck to Facebook or Twitter.
Mm.
I could be more concrete, by the way. But you know what? Let's leave it mysterious. Which internet weirdos I monitor, but could not do so through Twitter. Let's leave that as an unanswered question. I actually think that's a super important and useful thing to do. And if you're not doing something like that, you'll be very surprised by reality and unable to predict or understand what's happening.
Mm.
If you only know about opinions that are within the Overton window and the arguments that are within the Overton window, then your ability to understand American politics, for example, will be cut short because American politics is increasingly widening its Overton window and forces are at play that you would not even know existed if you were just stuck in the Facebook echo chamber or even the Twitter echo chamber. So from the consumer perspective, that's one side. The other perspective is that, Jake, I want to be cancel proof. I have some weird opinions that, if made public, would lead people to reject me, to reject association with me, to try to get me fired, all sorts of other things. You can guess what some of them are. Others, who knows? But cancelability is a risk for anybody who's employed, and I am indeed employed. I would like to be immune to that, to be able to speak to the world, to be able to say things to my friends and to others, even if my Facebook account is shut down, my Twitter account is shut down, my Google and my Gmail are all blocked to me, and even my bank accounts are closed or frozen, and my assets are frozen. I would still like to be able to give and receive value. So that's what Bitcoin does for me. It's like insurance policy there. And I like to send and receive information. And that's why I use Signal and Nostr and Tor, the onion router, these other cypherpunk tools. Is they are insurance policies for me should anyone ever try to cancel me. So that's why I do it from both the consumer and producer side of things. How about
Awesome.
you?
No, that's a good breakdown. Well,
I know you made a switch. You were very active on Twitter, and then you shut that down, or at least that kind of ebbed, and you've moved to be just on Nostr. Is that where you are right now?
Yeah. So on a personal capacity, I'm only posting on Nostr. I've started my podcast this January, and to take a kind of capital allocation lens, it's very obvious that over a long enough time horizon, investing capital into any one of the major social media channels is very, very high platform risk. And why bother? Now, the reason that I am currently posting on all of them is because I've started a podcast. It's going to be a media business. I'm interested in putting a message out there. And I've got content that I'm already creating. It makes sense to spread it as far and as wide as possible. And so I see an Instagram or a Twitter, even TikTok, which has been surprisingly useless so far, but they're basically free distribution channels. It costs nothing to open an account. It costs me some money on the back end of creating this content to produce it effectively. So we create some medium form clips, maybe 5 to 8 minutes long, or we create short form stuff, which is, maybe a minute long with B-roll footage and some music and some subtitles. And for different people, they reach them in different places. And so it's about putting that information out as far and as wide as you can and just seeing what comes back. But the long-term play is Nostr. Absolutely. Like, I see Nostr as a critical tool for any media business in the future. And it's very simple. It's because you can't be switched off. Like, no one can take your npub and nsec away from you, providing you manage it correctly. And that's the way to build a publishing fortress, a digital publishing fortress. Why wouldn't you do it? And we're just very, very early, right? No one's even really thought about it from this perspective. And it flips the model on, like, okay, I've got to grab your attention, then try and throw products down your throat, to I'm going to create high quality content and the audience is going to pay me for it, value for value, in hard money. It flips the incentive around completely and makes the audience and the content creator more aligned, in my opinion. We're so early, right? It's still a case of trying things out, even figuring out how to post a full-length episode. You've got to set yourself up with a nostr.build account. You've then got to pay. This is actually something that came up recently, which is really interesting. Think how easy they make it to use Instagram or to use X. Like, where's the video hosting done? Well, it's done by them for you for free. Well, if it's free, are you the product? And so Nostr is flipping that around, and you're no longer the product. You can make it what you want. You can curate your own feed, and the ability to not get switched off by some arbitrary decision within a private company is gold dust for anyone who's interested in creating content. And it's not that it's that funny phrase, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And when you're playing on someone else's digital real estate, I absolutely respect the fact that they can do what they want with my account. That's fair enough.
And even if you don't respect it, you should still expect it, because they will.
Better phrase, yes. And then it's that whole question of like, who's God? Who's allowed to decide what you can and can't say?
Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah,
Elon
the
Musk.
Zark is
those are the gods that we worship.
Yeah,
on those respective platforms. That is
absolutely. Like Zark is Rome. I heard him described as that recently, right? This massive digital empire that he has an extraordinary controlling stake in. You know, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. It's absolutely wild. And not a dissimilar age to us, probably, right? But yes, at Nostr I'm very keen on. And it's an area that as a kind of startup media business, we're going to make an extra effort to invest into. I'm really keen to see what we learn from it.
Mind your values.
Yeah, well, they align very well.
Invest in the future you want.
Well, Andrew, listen, so 60 minutes has flown by. I really, really appreciate your time, and I've learned a lot from you today. So thank you so much for sharing everything.
Thank you, Jake. It's a pleasure to reconnect, and I'll see you in Bali or somewhere else, I'm sure.
Yes, I hope so. I have one last question. If anyone wants to reach out, Andrew, and get in touch, where would you point them?
Our website is resistance.money, from which you can find links to me, my co-authors, our NPubs, our Twitter handles, and more.
Awesome. And I recently got sent an email from the guys doing Cheat Code in the UK, because I was the MC for Cheat Code in Sydney in October last year. And I won't be going all the way to England from Australia for it, sadly, but I see that you're on the list there as a speaker. So have a wonderful trip.
Thanks, man. Cheat Code was a great experience last year. I'm really looking forward to coming again. Bedford is good. We like Pete. We like that crew.
Yeah, they've done great stuff. All right. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you. Cheers.